Hello students, today we shall discuss one of the first feminist playwrights in American literature. Her name is Lillian Hellman, and the play that we will discuss today is The Children's Hour. This was written in 1934. Now let us look at it objectively. The Children's Hour is a 1934 American play by Lillian Hellman. It is a drama set in an all-girls boarding school run by two women, Karen Wright and Martha Doby. An angry student, Mary Tilford, runs away from the school, and to avoid being sent back, she tells her grandmother that the two headmistresses are having a lesbian affair. The play is perhaps one of the first American literature to discuss the topic of the same-sex relationships and accusation that proceed to destroy the women's careers, relationships, and lives. Now let me introduce you to Lillian Hellman as a playwright. Lillian Hellman was born on 20th June 1905. She died on 30th June 1984. She was famous as an American dramatist and screenwriter known for her success as a playwright on Broadway. Hellman was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, into a Jewish family. Her mother was Julia Newhouse of Demopolis, Alabama, and her father was Max Hellman, a New Orleans shoe salesman. During most of her childhood, Lillian spent half of each year in New Orleans in a boarding home run by her aunts and the other half in New York City. She studied for 2 years at New York University and then took several courses at Columbia University. The Children's Hour is a combative play that challenged the moral values of contemporary American society. Its story is about two women who run a private school for girls. When they are unjustly accused by a student of being lesbians, outraged community members withdraw their children, forcing the school to close. When one of the women realizes that she is attracted to her colleague, she commits suicide. Before Hellman wrote The Children's Hour, several Broadway plays had addressed lesbianism. However, her own play struck harder at the pieties and conventions of the contemporary life. It suggested that intolerance could result in witch hunts, ruining lives and careers. As much as it implied sexual content, the play's implicit political content led to its censorship. In 1952, during the midst of the McCarthyist attacks on leftist political beliefs, made revival of The Children's Hour again a cause célèbre. The Broadway production of the play was not censored. However, copies of the play were removed from overseas US libraries, and Hellman was blacklisted in Hollywood. This was the decade after the war, when the US wanted women out of their wartime work back in the home and serving their menfolk. The independence of Martha and Karen in The Children's Hour is an un-American as their lesbianism and seems fatally tangled up with it. In the same year as Hellman's blacklisting, the young writer Patricia Highsmith, whose first novel, Strangers on a Train, had brought her fame, could not publish her second novel under her own name. The Price of Salt is about a lesbian relationship. Hellman wasn't lesbian or bisexual, yet her Dr. Joe character isn't introduced to shore up heterosexual values or to make anybody feel more comfortable, quite the opposite. Karen's relationship with Joe makes us ask ourselves, whom do we love and how do we express that love? Does society decide on love or do we? What makes it fine to love Joe and immoral to love Martha? When, in the last shocking act of the play, Martha realizes that she does not love Karen, the power is not so much in the revelation as in the revaluation. How can any of us know ourselves or live honestly in a society that tells us how to feel and how to think. As Hellman knew, the best censorship is self-censorship. Martha, in the play, realizes that she has been a stranger to herself. Karen suddenly understands how deep the bond between them is. Neither woman can any longer trust the society they were brought up to believe was benign. Martha shoots herself as Hedda does in Ibsen's Hedda Gabler. The gap between her inner and outer worlds is too great and cannot be bridged. The play had two film versions. These three, filmed in 1936, reworked the story into a heterosexual love triangle with Joe as a hunky hero, thus degrading the women's independence and reducing the power of the plot to the usual business of women who fight over men. In 1961, it was remade more faithfully as The Children's Hour with Audrey Hepburn as Karen and Shirley MacLaine as Martha. But there is nothing convincing about the sexual ambiguity, and Hepburn had to be saved to convincing Hollywood heterosexuality, where the nasty past will put right by a happy home and a husband. In theatres though, the play as it stood was a huge hit, and neither audience nor critics shied away from its painful difficulty. When it was passed over for the Pulitzer Prize because of its subject matter, influential critics who had raved about its power and truthfulness set up their own award, the Drama Critics Circle Award, and gave it to Hellman. Even so, the play was still banned in some US states and cities, and in London had to be put at the Gates Theatre Club because of censorship rules. In Paris, it was staged as The Innocents. Why is sexuality such a problem? Why does it continue to be so? Sexual expression is the most fundamental form of human expression, and as such should be a place of individual freedom, not a site of social control. Only a few years before Hellman's play, Radcliffe Hall's novel The Well of Loneliness, 1928, had been banned in Britain. E.M. Forster had refused publication for his own homosexual novel, Morris, until after his death. Fast forward another 10 years, and America, land of the free, was busy with its own style of inquisition and incarceration. As Hellman was standing before the Committee for Un-American Activities and a play was back on the Broadway, Arthur Miller was writing The Crucible, a dramatization of the Salem witch trials and a play certainly influenced by The Children's Hour. The Crucible and The Children's Hour don't date because we are still caught in the issues they raise: lies, whispering, power, propaganda, the size of the system, whether in a small town or national government, and the hope for an end to man's inhumanity to women and man. Also a hope for dignity, freedom and love. Let us discuss the play. The Children's Hour premiered in New York at the Maxine Elliott Theatre on November 28, 1934, with a cast of relatively unknown actors. The play was based on an essay the playwright had encountered, titled The Closed Doors. It related the true story of two female teachers who were condemned by the community when a student alleged that they were having a homosexual affair. It was produced and directed by Herman Shumlin, for whom Hellman had been working as a script reader. Shumlin knew the risk of bringing the work of a novice playwright directly to the Broadway stage without an out-of-home tryout, but he had great faith in the play. From the onset, he was confident of the work's quality and felt it was needed little of the refinement and rewriting that is generally done during the preview performances. Because of its theme, The Children's Hour also gained some notoriety. Initially, it was banned in Boston, Chicago, and London. The flap over its content also scared off the Pulitzer Prize Selection Committee, which refused to attend a single performance of the play. Ironically, it was the theme of the play that kept it relevant enough to lead a revision and stage revival in 1952, at which time it also served as an oblique criticism of the hearing then being conducted by House Un-American Activities Committee. By the time Hellman had been blacklisted, forbidden employment for her political beliefs in Hollywood, which added fuel to the continuing controversy over the play. It remained banned in Boston, but by 1962, when another screen adaptation was released, its frank, if understated treatment of the lesbian theme no longer fanned the fires of moral outrage, allowing a much more objective assessment of Hellman's considerable achievement. The summary of the children's are: two women, Karen Wright and Martha Dobby, have worked hard to build a girls' boarding school in a refurbished farmhouse. They run and teach the school with somewhat unwelcome help of Lily Motter, Martha's aunt. One pupil, Mary Tilford, is mischievous, disobedient, and untruthful, and often leads the other girls into trouble. One day, when Mary feigns illness and is being examined by Dr. Joe Carden, a physician who is Mary's cousin and also Karen's fiancé, Martha asks Lily whether she would like to go back to traveling to the places she misses. Now they could afford it. Lily becomes angry and starts shouting about how, whenever Joe is around, Martha becomes irritable, unreasonable, and jealous, taking her jealousy of Joe out of her. Two of Mary's friends, listening at the door, trying to discover Mary's condition, overhear Lily's outburst. Mary is found healthy and is sent to her room and squeezes the information out of the girls. Mary plans to ask her grandmother, Amelia Tilford, who not only indulges her but also helped Karen and Martha a great deal in setting up the school, to allow her not to return. When Amelia refuses, Mary cleverly twists what the girls had overheard. With the help of several well-crafted lies and a book that the girls have been reading in secret, Mary convinces her grandmother that Karen and Martha are having a lesbian affair. On hearing this, Amelia Tilford begins contacting the parents of Mary's classmates. Shortly, most of Mary's friends have been pulled out of school. Rosalie Wells, a student whose mother is abroad, stays with Mary. On discovering that Rosalie is vulnerable, Mary blackmails her into corroborating everything she says. When Karen and Martha realize why all their pupils were pulled out of their school in a single night, they go to Mrs. Tilford's residence to confront her. Amelia tells Mary to repeat her story. When Karen points out an inconsistency, Mary pretends to have been covering for Rosalie, who reluctantly corroborates Mary's story for fear of being exposed herself. Resolving to take Amelia to court, Martha and Karen leave. 7 months later, after Martha and Karen have lost the case, everyone still believes that they were lovers. When Lily returns from abroad to take care of her niece, the women angry with her for not having stayed in the country in order to testify their innocence. Meanwhile, Joe, who has remained loyal throughout, has found a job in a distant location. He tries to convince Karen and Martha to come with him and start over. As Martha goes to prepare dinner, Joe continues his attempts to persuade Karen, who now believes that she has ruined his life and destroyed everything that she and Martha had worked so hard to achieve. At Karen's insistence, Joe reluctantly asks her whether she and Martha had ever been lovers. When Karen says that they were not, he readily believes. Nevertheless, Karen decides that she and Joe must part. She explains that things can never be the same between them after all they have been through. She asks Joe to leave and he refuses. He agrees to leave if Karen will think things through before finalizing the breakup. When Martha returns and finds out from Karen what has happened, she is consumed with guilt. Her discovery that she might indeed have feelings for Karen overwhelms and terrifies her. Before Martha tells Karen how she feels, Karen tells Martha that she would like to relocate in the morning and wants her to come with her. Martha says it's impossible for them to live comfortably again and eventually admits her feeling for Karen. Karen responds dismissively, saying that they never felt this way for each other. Martha continues, but Karen tells Martha that she is tired and they can talk about it in the morning. As Karen sits in her room, she hears a shot. Martha has killed herself. Shortly after, Amelia Tilford arrives to beg Karen's forgiveness since Mary's lies have now been uncovered. Karen explains to her that it's too late. Mary lies, together with the community's willingness to believe and spread malicious gossips, have destroyed 3 innocent lives. Now, an analysis of the play. The Children's Hour is a combative play that challenges the moral values of contemporary American society. It is a story about 2 women who run a private school for girls. When they are unjustly accused by a pupil of being lesbians, outraged community members withdraw their children, forcing the school to close. When one of the women realizes that she is sexually attracted to a colleague, she commits suicide. Before Hellman wrote The Children's Hour, several Broadway plays had addressed lesbianism. However, her own play struck harder at the pieties and conventions of contemporary life. The Broadway production of the play was not censored. However, copies of the play were removed from overseas US libraries. Hellman adapted her play to the screen in 1936, changing its title to These Three and altering its plot so that it involved a heterosexual love triangle instead of lesbianism. Most readings of American playwright Hellman focus on the psychosocial power of the adolescent-driven gossip, rumors, and slander, and the frightening outcomes that can emerge when people lose their ability to reason, question, analyze, and criticize the world around them. Mary's evil behavior suggests that she is caught in a net of shifting social values concerning sexuality and gender roles, and uses wickedness as a strategy to order and control her chaotic world. As an orphan, an outcast, and a young woman grappling with her own developmental issues, Mary desires to gain status within Lancet, Massachusetts by exposing and attempting to eliminate cultural anxieties about gender and sexuality, as well as the changes in social mores and challenges to the family unit. Hellman as a playwright. As America's first and most successful playwright, Lillian Hellman began her dramatic career at the age of 29 with The Children's Hour. With 691 performances, it was her longest running play. A book review and a reader for films and play scripts, Hellman read an account of an early 19th century Scottish trial about a child's false accusations ruining reputations. This, Hellman's first play, contains nearly all the themes and dramatic devices used in her other 11 dramas. Hellman created many ambitious female characters that, by greedy overreaching, leave death and destruction in their wake. Mary Tilford's ruthless manipulations of a classmate and a wealthy grandmother to wield power over them is echoed in many other Hellman characters who seek undeserved power or wealth. Amelia Tilford's family loyalty in believing her granddaughter's contrived distress leads to several deaths of the girls' school, of Karen and Joe's relationship, and of Martha through her suicide. Other Hellman's plays, such as Little Foxes, trace how distorted family allegiances result in ethical compromises and devastation. Mrs. Tilford's belief at the end that money will relieve her conscience and Karen's pain demonstrates Hellman's harsh criticism of the wealthy classes and capitalism. Hellman has a fast-moving plot using secrecy and increasing suspense, spaced detail about the past, and deftly drawn characters who speak everyday language. Hellman introduces blackmail, a device that resurfaces in all her drama. Mary blackmails Rosalie, a petty thief, into supporting her story about Karen, and Martha inappropriately kissing. This is an example of the terror inflicted on victims in other Hellman plays. Characters and morals in the plays. Let us discuss that. In the first half of the play, Karen punishes Mary harshly. Martha gets rid of her aunt, Mrs. Mortar, by speaking cruel words, and Mrs. Tilford spreads the news that causes the withdrawal of all children from Wright Doby School. These three characters emphasize the principle of justice and think they are doing the right thing without making consideration the feelings of other people. These three characters emphasize the principle of justice and think they are doing the right thing without taking into consideration the feelings of other people. As a result, Mary tells the lie to take her revenge on the two teachers. Karen and Martha file the libel suit to fight with Mrs. Tilford, and Mrs. Mortar rejects the chance to give a positive testimony in the court. They put strict justice first and see no need for forgiveness or tolerance, and thus Karen and Martha, who lose the libel suit, become the main victims in the inevitable tragedy. At the end of the play, after Karen's name is cleared and Martha commits suicide, Mrs. Tilford, the victimizer, suffers because her conscience will torture her with the fact that she wronged two innocent young women and ruined their lives. Mrs. Tilford joins Karen and Martha in the group of people who victimize others at first and end up becoming victims mainly because of their insistence upon the pursuit of justice without mercy. The three main characters, Karen, Martha and Mrs. Tilford, will be the focus in the first part of this work to reveal the real origin of the tragedy. Then the revenge taken by Mary and others is also important. Only after Martha's death and Mrs. Tilford's repentance does Karen finally realize the meaning of mercy when she forgives Mrs. Tilford and faces the rest of her life with a new attitude. The major theme in the play. Now, one of the major themes in this play is mercy versus justice. It is spelled out in the beginning of the play, when we have the scene in the classroom where Mrs. Mortar is instructing the girls by having them recite some lines from The Merchant of Venice. The students obviously do not enjoy the recitation. Even Peggy, the girl who is reciting, does not concentrate on what she is reading, as she is described as being bored and raises her voice intentionally to give warning signals to Evelyn. The teacher, Mrs. Mortar, does not enjoy the class any more than the students. She is described as listening with eyes closed in her over-fancy clothes with obviously touched up hair. Mrs. Mortar is dissatisfied with Peggy's unemotional voice and demands that she repeat the line with a feeling of pity. Villains and victims in the play. In discussions about the villains and victims in the tragedy, commentators tend to focus on Mary, who initiates the lie. Mrs. Mortar, whose complaints against the two young women and her absence in court contribute to the credibility of the accusation, and Mrs. Tilford, who endorses the accusation by spreading the news, which convinces parents to withdraw all the girls from school. Looking back on the tragic events, one agrees that Mary is still the first to blame, since she pieces bits of information from here and there together and tells an ugly lie which directly leads to the rest of the tragedy. For audience, it is perhaps the most shocking thing that such an apparently evil act is undertaken by a little girl who is usually assumed to be innocent or helpless in literary tradition. In fact, Hellman never intends Mary to be an essentially evil character, noting, "It's the results of her lie that make her so dreadful." While attention is usually focused on Mary, the individuals who help the lie take shape and create an environment in which it can be so easily propagated and believed are less often considered. Indeed, the key factor that can turn Karen from a victimizer to a victim is precisely her insistence on justice and a lack of mercy towards those who have done wrong. She does not pay attention to Mary's psychological need to be recognized and appreciated in public, thinking that it is right to expose the lie and punish the delinquent child. Karen does not realize that her role is not primarily that of a judge who pursues righteousness and justice, but rather a teacher who educates, guides, and ideally inspires the students to strive for a brighter future. Obviously, Karen's teaching and corrections do not achieve this goal with regards to Mary. The play concludes on a tragic note. Not until Martha's death does Karen finally learn the lesson contained in the opening quote from Shakespeare, and thus learn more about the ways of the world and understand the true meaning of mercy. Therefore, when Mrs. Mortar tells her that she is still young, despite all the events, she answers, "Not anymore." She does not panic or cry over Martha's death. She only accepts all that has happened with a calm and understanding attitude without looking into the root cause of things or pursuing justice further. She becomes more mature with a new perspective on the meaning of life. This is why when Mrs. Stilford pleads for mercy and forgiveness, Karen is willing to consent and even accept her help only to make the old woman feel better, even though it is right after Martha's suicide. Karen thus decides not to get revenge by making Mrs. Stilford suffer for the damage she has caused, for Martha's death has clearly demonstrated the dangers of pushing justice too far. As for the problem of Mary, Karen understands that it is something that will haunt Mrs. Stilford for the rest of her life. Therefore, she says to Mrs. Stilford, "It is over for me now, but will never end for you. She harmed us both, but she's harmed you more, I guess." Karen's mind is finally more enlightened and tender. As the weather outside gets warmer, she realizes that only through forgiveness can she really put a stop to the tragedy and start a new life. It is thus the scene of heavenly mercy against the rule of human justice that the ending of the play truly intends to convey. I hope you like the story and the play. I would suggest that you read the play and try to understand Hellman's use of metaphors, language, and dialogue